which is what we're going to talk about today, but also racial disparities, gender disparities, geographic disparities, and other things that I like to write about. And I actually helped Michael put his resume together a few years ago now. And so I can tell you he's extremely impressive. I had been friends with you for years before I had any idea how impressive you were. Um, has been to the White House, advised many White Houses, many administrations, spoken all around the world to very prestigious organizations, a lot of impressive publications. Um, Several books to your name. So anyway, but today we are going to talk about one of your latest papers that you wrote for FreeOp, where you work now, which is a DC-based think tank. Um, and that paper is about examining the evidence for and against the economic impacts of the institution of marriage. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So thank you so much for taking the time, Mr.
Yeah.
Tanner and Gwen. So we both read the paper, but I want to go ahead and just ask if you would add anything to that intro that people should know about you before we start this conversation. Oh, one more point of expertise. I said this on Facebook, but between the three of us, we've been married 5 times. So that's a little bit of expertise on the topic of marriage.
Yeah, I guess you're a little bit behind, Kathy.
Oh, I'm working on it. I live with my boyfriend. It'll happen. I'll be on marriage number 2 eventually. But yeah, so yeah, tell us, Michael, like what the TLDR of your paper is. What are the top line findings? Like, what did you set out to look into, and what did you find?
Sure. Well, I say I do work now for the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and we devote our efforts at FreeOp to the lower half of incomes in America. What can be done to raise those incomes? And particularly, I focus on social mobility and poverty and how we can get people who are in poverty today out of it and how we can help people avoid poverty. And for many years, there's been a sort of a consensus growing on sort of this from the center left to the right around something called the success sequence, which is the idea that if you work, you have a job, basically any kind of job, you finish high school at least, and preferably go on and get something beyond that, and avoid having children outside of marriage, that you can not likely to be poor if you do those things. And there's a fair amount of debate about all of them and the degree to which each of those has an impact. Some of them seem fairly obvious. If you're working, the chances of you being poor go down. That seems to make sense. A job is kind of essential to avoiding poverty. Education ties in a lot with jobs, so you can see where at least finishing high school at least is important to staying out of poverty. But the most contentious one, and the one I think that's on the weakest ground, is the idea of marriage, and that was the idea that if you can get more low-income people to marry, there will be less poverty. So the paper essentially is a deep dive into that, and what I concluded was 2 things. Number 1 was that it's limited, but there is an impact to marriage that does help people get out of poverty, and we can talk about what people and how that impact plays out in real life and what the problems are with it. And the second is that there's relatively little the government can do to get people to marry. That essentially government's idea of incentivizing marriage or regulating marriage isn't going to be very effective. But there are some things that government can do to get out of the way that will make it easier for people to get married. And the government can also do some things to help broaden the marriage pool, if you will, to make more potential marriage partners, particularly with low income, low education men, which are not very good marriage partners today.
Totally. Thank you so much. And um, please, like, either type your questions in the chat or be thinking of them, because we want to do an audience Q&A as we do this, either in the second half or maybe just as it comes up, whatever feels natural. But yeah, I want to dive deeper into all of those things. One of the things that the first thing that comes to mind is did you and how do other researchers disentangle the effect of the act of getting married from being the kind of person who gets and stays married?
Yeah, that's very tough. There's a real chicken and egg problem when you do the research on this. You just look at the correlation. The correlation between married and not being poor uh, is fairly strong. The fact is that if you're married, you're not likely to live in poverty. If you're married and you have kids, you're much less likely to be in poverty than if you're single and you have kids. So we can say the correlation is very strong, but which way does the correlation run? That one is a much tougher thing to sort of tease out.
Mhm.
And the evidence does suggest that that it takes certain skills to get married, and those are the very skills that keep people out of poverty to some degree. That if you take two dysfunctional people and you marry them, you end up with two dysfunctional people. Not necessarily, it doesn't create function out of that. So you've got to be very careful what you're pushing there. And simply saying that if we could just take all low income people and get them married, they won't be low income anymore. There's no evidence to suggest that that's the case.
Totally. And it's so interesting, like what correlates with being married, besides not being in poverty. So being in good health correlates with being married. Having more education correlates with being married. Having a higher income correlates with being married. Having a more pleasant personality, which is kind of hard to correct for in the data, but when they have looked at like Big Five, for example, um, people who are more agreeable tend to get and stay married, unsurprisingly. So, yeah, it's hard to, like you said, disentangle. Is it that they got married because they were attractive, and had an easier time getting along with other people, or something else? And then, but you did say that you felt like there was at least some benefit to marriage. What do you base that on?
Sure. Well, we do see that particularly for men, when they marry, they go benefit on a variety of measures. They are more likely to earn more income after they get married, whether it's because they feel like they have to work harder or whatever. You can argue the different reasons for it, but their income does tend to go up. They tend to be happier after they're married. They tend to have better sex after they're married. There's a lot of
And more
things.
sex.
More sex.
Which is
Yeah, not
funny
necessarily
because
better, but
that's
more.
not
Yeah.
like the way our media would portray it, right? That's
Yeah, totally. Like the marriage is the end of a swinging sex life when it's actually the beginning for the average man.
yeah.
That's right. That's right. So, on all these sort of things, and health that you mentioned, all those sorts of things tend to improve. They actually tend to get more education, and they tend to improve their lives in a lot of ways. Doesn't necessarily hold the same for women. There's some benefits to them, and it depends on sort of at what level you start at. We know that essentially there's two different types of marriage. Charles Murray used to talk about Beacon Hill, and Fishtown as two different
Mm.
communities. One was low income, and one was high income. We do know that if you're a college educated woman, for example, you're going to get married. The marriage rates are going down for everybody, but college educated men and women get married. Lower income men and women don't get married, at least as not as much. And there's a lot of things that go into that, but it does make a difference.
Yeah, so when you look at the marriage rates for people with degrees and people in the top half of the income distribution, they're like this. When you look at people without college degrees and in the bottom half, that's where pretty much all of the declines are happening. So when you say that the marriage rate is down, that's not, I mean, it's true, but only because we've averaged it out. But it's actually almost only down among people in the bottom half of income and education in the United States.
And divorce rates are much higher for lower income people as well.
That's right.
What
Most of the
one thing
divorces.
that surprised me though, and maybe you could address why this is that so I was married 21 years in a traditional kind of we got married in 1980 and then I'm a professional wife because I have been married to my second husband for 21 years also. I've always worked, but the thing that I was confused by is since I've been less a part of organized religion and like these social norms that my parents had because they were quite a lot older, that I didn't really understand why marriage in itself made a difference. Because to me, cohabitating would, like, if you are each contributing to the care of children, each contributing to the financial resources in the home, your findings say that still marriage has a benefit that cohabitating doesn't. And I didn't understand why that would be. If you made a commitment, whether you engaged in this cultural norm or puritanical norm or religious norm or whatever you want to call marriage and the state involvement with a piece of paper, what made the difference?
Can I
Yeah,
take a stab at this?
pardon?
Can I take a stab?
Sure.
One of the benefits of marriage is that it acts as a social insurance program. So if you're by yourself and you lose a job or have an injury or in any way like need support, um, you are less likely than someone who's married to like be able to weather that uh, negative event without major long-term disruptions. Like you're less likely to lose your housing, for example, if you have a spouse that is like employed. So the I would guess that one of the differences between a cohabitating couple and a married couple is that the married couple is more likely to actually act as that insurer for the spouse versus somebody you're just living with. Um, I think you're probably more likely to just, separate when someone needs a lot of help if you're merely living together versus married. That's my guess.
Yeah, I think it adds a layer of friction to just the separation that can slow things down and give people a chance to work things through as well. We do know that cohabiting relationships are not as stable as marriage relationships are. They last less. They don't last as long. They're more likely to break up. Women who fall out of a marriage don't do well. Period. But falling out of a cohabiting arrangement, they do even worse.
Mhm.
So in general, it's not a substitute. I've never understood why a piece of paper stamped by the government made a difference either. But apparently it does.
I think
So
the other
so
thing
the
that's really
Goldie
hard.
Hawn oh, sorry.
Well, I was
The
going to say, I
Goldie
think
Hawn Kurt Russell model is an exception and not a rule.
on average, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this goes back to the chicken or the egg issue. I think that there is probably a bunch of stuff that's just different on average between couples who marry and couples who merely cohabitate.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a segment of cohabitation that does very well. That is the Goldie Hawn Kurt Russell model. But I think then there's another group of the sort of it's basically just serial monogamy with a house.
Yeah, I
Well,
mean,
there
especially in the
is
bottom half, a lot of people live together less because they've made a commitment to each other and more to take advantage of those economies of scale because the rent is too damn high.
yeah. That's I yeah, I when I read through the paper a couple of times and I guess it's my own perspective that um that just found it like weird to me. But then maybe that has something to do with my level of commitment. And I will say that my husband and I, when we first met, we thought we wouldn't get married legally. And and there were a couple of things. One, we lived on a military base, and the only way to get housing together was to get married. But the other thing was I I couldn't see myself at 60 saying, "Oh, this is my whatever." I mean,
Man
boyfriend was
friend.
stupid, yeah, and I think in our society, certainly, if people aren't married, there is an assumption that someone has a commitment issue. whether
Yeah,
that's true or not. I think that's just part of our society.
and I think that's true. I know, my wife and I cohabited when we first got together as well. But eventually, she has children from her first marriage, and we decided that getting married was to model the relationship for them was a good move because it demonstrated our commitment in other ways. There's also some interesting evidence to suggest that at least among lower income and lower education women in particular, they place a huge value on marriage. In fact, it's one of the reasons why they fear divorce. There's actually a greater stigma to divorce than there is to having children outside of marriage. They tend to be very reluctant to marry now because they think it might fail. They might fail. The marriage might fail. Whereas in cohabitation, it's sort of more of an experiment. It doesn't carry the same weight for them.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And it kind of comports with other data that shows that income and education correlate with lower levels of income and education correlate with more uh I don't want to use the term reactionary because it's a bit stigmatizing, but I don't want to use the term traditional because it's not accurate, but socially conservative with socially conservative beliefs. So people with lower levels of income and education tend to be less gender egalitarian. They tend to be more religious. They tend to have higher levels of sexism. Um, they tend to be more racist and homophobic, yada yada. So I guess, like, in a culture where and that's the thing, to finish the thought, in a culture where we associate marriage with religiosity, then it would kind of make sense for people with lower levels of income and education to value marriage more. But this gets back to, like, something that's really interesting to me, which is, what is marriage? I'm currently reading Stephanie Kuntz's book, on marriage, and what it's really hammering home for me, I mean, back in the gay marriage debate, I was really struck by, like, how hard it was for me to define, like, exactly what we're talking about. Are we talking about a primarily legal institution? Are we talking about a primarily religious institution? Like, obviously it's both, but, like, what defines it? Is it by who's allowed to engage in it? Is it defined by what rights and privileges it offers? Like, what makes marriage marriage? And what she's found is that throughout space and time, in different eras of human history and looking at different societies across the world, very little consistently defines marriage. I mean, between two people, there are many exceptions. Heterosexual, there are many exceptions. Uh, a lot of marriage customs, norms don't have to do with sex or reproduction necessarily. And in fact, one of her theses is that it's much more uniform throughout space and time for marriage norms. They don't all have to do with property or inheritance. The thing that really unites marriage norms, if there's anything, and there are exceptions to this as well, is that it provides in-laws. That's the thing that people are doing when they get married. Is they're getting new in-laws. So I just think that's an important thing to, like, acknowledge as we talk about this topic, is that the definition of marriage is highly contested and contextual.
Yeah, the
And
old
then
saying that says, how can it be traditional marriage if it doesn't even unite warring tribes?
there we go.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well
But
put.
I do in the paper talk about the fact that we've got to be very careful that we don't tie government programs and government incentives and everything that the government gets involved in to a 1950s model of a male breadwinner and a woman and a wife who stays home and then and takes care of the kids. That model of marriage is really dead now. Even in the best of circumstances, if you have young children, whatever, most women still work, and they work full time. In addition, unfortunately, to having to then work around the house because the men don't do their fair share. But that sort of 1950s model, Mad Men is no longer there.
Well, and it's not like, oh, look what they took from us. It was never really there. I mean, first of all, women throughout history have worked. It has been the norm in human societies for women to contribute financially to the household well-being. The term cottage industry comes from the goods and services that women would provide in cottages. They would brew beer, they would spin yarn, they would create textiles, like they would do domestic labor for other people's homes. Like the idea that like women working is something that started to happen in the 70s is absolutely ahistorical and ludicrous. Um, and even in the 50s and 60s, it was still even then a minority of women who didn't have to work outside the home. Um, and in the 70s, the influx of female labor force participation among unmarried women and among women of color, married or not, was always high. The women who entered the labor force were married white women in the 70s. So, um, you know, to describe the male breadwinner model and especially the stay-at-home wife model as traditional is totally bonkers. Um, the other thing I wanted to talk about too was that what gets me about the whole success sequence is it posits that and there's this term Rob Henderson likes to use, luxury beliefs, that the top half continues to get married before they have kids, continues to stay married, follows the success sequence, but then tells lower class people, oh, you don't have to do that. Those are outdated norms. And that's why the lower class isn't doing it. But that's, again, totally divorced from the evidence, because all of the evidence indicates that not only has the desire to get married not really changed since the 1950s, so the average American is just as interested in marriage, values marriage, wants to get married just as much today as they did in 1950. But if anything, people in the lower classes value marriage more highly. They're just not doing it as often for reasons that we're discussing. So this idea that it's the culture or we've denigrated marriage, or no, people don't want to get married anymore because the upper class people are telling them not to, like, is just totally divorced from the evidence.
Yeah, I will say though, the one interesting caution on that is to suggest that the culture has changed in the cultural sense. There's a not a truism there. But there was a study done on the fracking industry in Pennsylvania, that after there was the fracking boom and low income, low skilled men, their incomes suddenly shot up. They were suddenly much more marriageable. People expected there to be a marriage boom. There was not. And it may just be that there wasn't enough time, that these things take a lot more time to settle down. It may be a one-off that we don't know why that happened, but it also may just be that for various reasons, the culture has declined in terms of marriage being a particular goal. If you look at some of the polling on it, the question of whether or not you need to be married in order to have a good life has declined significantly. Not so much for men, who actually still see that as sort of a rite of passage to the good life, but women increasingly say that it's an important thing. It's something I like. It's something I want, but it's no longer the defining characteristic of my search for meaning in the world.
Hmm.
I don't doubt that that's true. I just doubt that it explains much. And do you know whether that, like, have you looked at that broken out by income and education? So what I would expect is that top half women are much more likely to agree with that statement, that marriage is not a requirement for a happy life, than bottom half women. And I think that because for top half women, it's more true. Like, the alternatives to not getting married and having kids are a lot better. They're better than they used to be, and they're better than they are for bottom half women. The jobs are better. Um, Depending on one salary is better. Like, they're more interesting jobs, they're safer jobs, they're better paying jobs. The stigma against being unmarried is way down. So all that's true for the stigma is true for top and bottom half, but it's actually probably more true for the top half. I imagine that being single as a top half woman is less stigmatized than being single as a bottom half woman because of the regressive views that bottom half people tend to hold compared to top half people. So I just wonder if what that's showing is that there is a gap between what the views top half people hold and the way that they behave. Um, but it doesn't explain the way bottom half people are behaving. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that. I certainly think if you once if you have the job and you have the education and you have the social life and all the things that go with it, marriage is something you add to it. So I think that but if you don't have any of those sort of things, then marriage becomes much more of a focus. The problem is that you then have to turn that around and say, okay, who are you going to marry? And there always seems to be this assumption out there that people always have pointed to, for example, women of color and the high out of wedlock non-marital birth rates in the community and so on. They say, well, just get everybody married. I always wanted to know exactly who they're supposed to marry.
Mm.
I haven't noticed this giant collection of, of black computer programmers in the inner city waiting around to get married. I mean, you can look at the work that William Julius Wilson's done, and how the criminal justice system's taken 1.5 million black men out of the marriage pool. You can look at the lack of education in general in low income communities. You can look at the fact that the average unmarried man in the bottom half, his income is well below that of married men, and you can suggest that that doesn't mean he's not bringing premium in terms of financial assistance into the household. They're more likely to be abuse in lower income households and so on. So marriage is a gamble. It's a gamble for everyone. It's a particular gamble for women. And for low income women, it is a big gamble. And to the degree that not being married is a viable option for them, that makes them less likely to take that gamble.
Absolutely.
Can I switch the kind of concentration just a little bit because I thought there were some really interesting points in your paper that I don't want to run out of time to talk about. So at the end, you just spoiler alert, you kind of conclude that the government should just get out of the business of trying to influence people's behavior with regards to marriage. But you also throughout your paper talk about lots of places where people are disadvantaged by marriage. And one of the people, Rob Clark, who is part of our live, he was talking about insurance plans, right? They also incentivize marriage and children being born within marriage in order to, how they price. And we know that most insurance is through our employers, 90 some percent. So tell us how in your research you saw that the government was in some way incentivizing or not incentivizing, and why you think that they should be out of the business of doing that.
Sure. Well, two different parts of that. One, in terms of the incentives for marriage, there's a certain common sense that goes with it that says that two people can do things that one person can't. If you have two people, you have potential for two incomes, which is chances are it's going to be higher than one. If you have two people in the household, you have two potential child care providers that's available there. Somebody is, single mothers that get sick. The kid gets sick. Who's going to take care of the kid? Do you take the day off from work? Do you then lose your job? How do you handle all those things? It doesn't work out evenly because men don't do 50% of the labor, but potentially
Mhm.
it's there to at least step in and do some things there. So to some extent, marriage has some common sense benefits to it that are an incentive to being married. As you mentioned, insurance and house, you have an economies of scale. You're buying, for two people, it's cheaper to feed two people than it is to feed two people separately. That sort of thing on that. In terms of the disincentives, I do look in the paper, for example, in terms of welfare programs. What's called we talk a lot about the welfare cliff, and we talk about it in terms of work, where if somebody gets a job, they lose their benefits and therefore are discouraged from getting a job. Well, same thing holds true with marriage. If you have two single people, one of which collects welfare, and they get married, they begin to lose those benefits right away, and they can actually end up with lower household income as a result of this. And that's progress from Medicaid, the EITC, food stamps, and on childcare, particularly bad. Section 8 vouchers are a problem with that. So all of these programs, there's essentially these cliffs built in that should be worked around. So I do think that those are sort of the things where government should be getting out of the way. In terms of things government can do, I think it should focus on those low education, low income men in terms of broadening that marriage pool. They can do things that can make it easier for men to get an education, for men to who aren't going to go on to college to get apprenticeships or to learn to do technical skills or to do other things that are going to raise their income, make them more employable, make them better husband material, if you will. And I think that that's the areas where the government can step in.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think the male breadwinner norm is one of the least appreciated, like most underappreciated contributors to declines in the marriage rate. Um, and I think that putting more men in a position to be breadwinners is something that if the government could do it, if certain policies could do it, is would probably be one of the things that would have the biggest impact on boosting the overall marriage rate. And one of the reasons I think that is because the male breadwinner norm is so strong. Like people have
Yeah.
such a strong preference for a male breadwinner. And when I see people, I mean men and women, top and bottom half, like everyone really wants a male breadwinner. And they're not insane to want that because male breadwinner marriages are much healthier and happier than non-male breadwinner marriages. Not because there's anything inherently better about them, but because marriages that don't have a male breadwinner are so heavily stigmatized. And because men
Oh,
who are not breadwinners are really shitty husbands because their masculinity feels threatened.
so and we've talked about this last week. So you and I are a different generation. Um, Mike and I are same generation, and I'm still so surprised about that accepted norm, like that women still want to marry up, and
Strongly.
and it's so like bizarre to me what that there's still that expectation, and um, it's just shocking to me.
Well,
It,
that is changing, however. You can look at education, for example. It used to be against the norm that women had higher education than their husband.
yep,
That wasn't the case for many years. That's changed now, and it's much more accepted that if the wife is more has gone on and got a higher degree than the husband, that's not considered bad. It's still income is still a major problem with that, but I suspect that that too may change over time as we develop it. The question is going to be whether men, how we can get to not stigmatize men who are more willing to fit into that new model that we're out there that's more egalitarian, and that's something I think that all sides in the political debate can work on.
I mean, I sure as heck hope so. And I think it makes sense for everyone to, well, for women to want a male breadwinner because men who aren't breadwinning aren't, not only aren't making up for what they're not bringing in terms of income with domestic labor or childcare. So it's not like, oh, well, maybe I'll have a breadwinner husband, or maybe I'll have someone who would do the other stuff for me. It's like, okay, if I don't have a breadwinner, I've got a guy who's not just not spending that time that he would have spent working and not only not making up for what he's not bringing in terms of income with housework and childcare, but men who are not breadwinners on average do less housework and less childcare than fully employed breadwinner husbands. And in fact, husbands who are unemployed do less housework and childcare on average than husbands and fathers who are working full time and earning the breadwinner income. So if you're a rational woman, like, why would you sign up for that? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, the sort of stereotype that's going around out there about the guy living in his parents' basement playing video games. That there's actually some truth to that. That among a certain group
Statistically,
of men, that's not marriage material. That's a problem.
it's terrifying. I mean, especially when you consider that the, you know, between a third and a fifth of marriages involve physical violence, and that those rates are higher among uh, men who earn less than area median income. Uh, like you said, marriage is a risk. And so betting on a non breadwinner is a dangerous proposition.
We also know that when men lose their jobs,
Yes.
divorce is much more likely than if the wife loses her job. So if a man, if they're both working or he's working and she's not, and he loses his job, divorce is fairly prevalent under those circumstances.
Hmm.
So non breadwinner men are also more likely than breadwinner men to beat and cheat on their wives. And job loss increases the likelihood that a man will commit intimate partner violence.
Men don't handle stress well. I mean, that was a little bit of a
Particularly,
joke, but
no, but it's absolutely true. Men particularly respond poorly to stress that threatens their sense of masculinity. And when they're not breadwinners, either because they don't earn enough or because they become unemployed, because we as a society have made breadwinning not just a requirement of masculinity, but a lot of evidence indicates it is the centerpiece of masculinity in American society. Then not being a breadwinner is one of the most potent, powerful masculinity threats that a man can face. And they
oh, I can
they
totally see that. Income level is like a bragging right. It's the only bragging right because when you get to be 45 and you've running around, with a few extra pounds and you're getting older and, you've got kids who are needing to be taken to this or that. It that's the way men talk is, "Oh, I'm a VP of blah 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 and, I make." Maybe they don't say it out, the actual digits, but it's definitely a measurement of masculinity. I absolutely have seen that, and I've worked in predominantly male industries for probably the last, 20 or so years, and oh my gosh.
It's why this myth of the manufacturing the industries coming back someday that all politicians promise and none of them will ever be able to deliver is so prevalent because people think about that the guy who goes down to the factory and works 9 to 5 and it's just a model that they follow. And as it's gone away, not because it's all gone to China, but because of automation and things of that,
Mhm.
and it's just never coming back, no matter what both parties say. It's it's a it carries a lot of psychological weight because people still see that as what men do.
Yeah.
yeah. And I think it's really important as well to talk about a lack of breadwinners in terms of job quality. So if you look at the bottom half, again, where the declines in marriage are happening, and you look at, I've long said there, we require these couples be male breadwinner couples, but there aren't enough male breadwinners to go around. Well, I mean, if you look at labor force participation and average wages, even in the bottom half, it's higher for men on average. But I think what that misses is that David Artur has some really good research on what happened after the China shock, which is, kind of misnamed because around 85% of the decline in domestic manufacturing employment is a result of automation, not outsourcing, but whatever.
Yeah.
I'm chill. We'll call it the China shock. So, but after that, the quality and number of jobs actually increased overall. It was actually good on net for US employment. However, the labor market bifurcated into great jobs and shit jobs, comparatively speaking, compared to pre-China shock. And so um, these great jobs are very conducive to male breadwinning. They do require longer hours, but they're stable, they have benefits, they have predictable schedules, they pay enough to have a family, and that's fine. The jobs in the bottom half are increasingly not conducive to breadwinning and running a family. Their schedules are unpredictable. The jobs themselves are not stable. So it's hard to arrange childcare. The benefits are paltry or non-existent. The wages are low. And so while these men may be employed, technically speaking, a lot of them now, labor force participation among bottom half men is down, and average wages are stagnant in the bottom half. But in addition, the cost of living has increased greatly, and these jobs aren't paying more, and they're shittier in other ways, which makes these, again, breadwinner marriages much harder to accomplish in the bottom half.
Yeah, and if you look at income, if you were to chart it out, income versus the likelihood of your being married, what you find is that the lower man's income is, the less likely it is that he's going to be married, and it makes a really big difference. And once they get over about $50,000-$60,000 a year, almost all men are married. But under that, it moves down pretty fast in terms of their marriage possibilities. Women, it's largely flat, and in fact, it goes down slightly if as the more they earn too much, their likelihood of getting married actually declines slightly. But call it flat, while the male earnings curve is really up strong, really high correlation there.
Yeah, I can totally see it. Where and that's where the extreme, I don't even know, if politics aside, I think men of my generation and maybe a little bit younger, they grew up, their fathers, grandfathers went to the mill, to the mine, to the factory, and they thought that they were going to have the standard of living. And so then when those mid-range jobs, good paying, union benefits usually, when they disappeared, I see that, right? You're either a great job, which is um, requires usually lots of times higher education, and so you graduate, you have two paths, right? So that bifurcation happens. You graduate high school and you have no skills, so you can get retail service kind of low wage jobs, or you're on a path to at least start college, and then you get this you know tr- track that gets you to at least the $50,000 range that makes you marriageable. I know plenty of people who graduated from college, and they haven't really done anything great, but at least they're in that range, and that I've seen that, right? Oh, and you see it politically and how people are voting, and who they're supporting. Um, and actually, after having this conversation, I'm glad I have 4 daughters and 1 son instead of 4 sons and a daughter. I mean, it worries me.
There's good reason for that, and that's why I do think there needs to be more emphasis by the government on how we can help those lower education, lower skilled men who are not going to go on to college. And not everybody should go on to college. The return on
Right.
investment to college is not necessarily good for everybody. You don't want someone ending up with a degree that's barely usable and a huge amount of college debt. That's not
Which
what
has
we get
yeah,
to
which has happened.
get anywhere. What we need to do is find ways in which we can find people with other skills and make them employable in that sense. So we need more voc tech. in terms of education. We need to deal better with apprenticeships. We need to deal with community colleges. All of these sorts of things that we can do to make it easier to employ men, at the same time makes them more marriageable, which means that more women can marry them, and so everybody ends up better off.
The other thing I want to talk about is I was reading a post from the Institute for Family Studies today about how one of the leading causes of the drop in fertility is the drop in the rate of marriage, and also the correlation between when you ask people why they didn't have kids, a lot of them, more of them, at least in the study that they were talking about, say, I didn't find the right partner, than cited economic concerns, which I thought was really interesting. But the solution that they were posing, this author was posing, was this concept of the cornerstone versus capstone marriages. And so their argument is marriage used to be seen as the cornerstone of your life. So you got married early, and then you took from that foundation, you went from that foundation to, college or career or kids, whatever, buying a house, whatever you were going to
Built
accomplish.
it together.
You built it together, exactly. Whereas today, marriage is seen as the capstone of a life. So once you build a foundation of owning a home, having a good job, having your education, then the final piece is marriage. And so that needs to be flipped. To give that idea credit, as Michael was saying, there is evidence that marriage does spring men into adulthood, that men who get married are more likely, seemingly as a result of getting married, to finish their degree or get certified in a trade, become gainfully employed, and financially contribute to their families. Men seem to need marriage in order to become adults in a way that women don't. And when you look at immigrant families, for example, they tend to, people who immigrate to the US tend to marry very young, and immigrant men have much higher labor force participation rates than native born men. So the capstone versus cornerstone does seem to have some validity. However, when you pose that as a solution to this problem of listless men not in education, employment, or training, stuck in their parents' basements, and say, well, women should just take a risk and marry those guys young, and some percentage of them will rise to the occasion. You have to consider what happens otherwise, right? And so we've talked about, for the men who don't rise to the occasion, who don't become breadwinners, that's a horrible situation. And then in addition, there are the risks of, domestic violence, that it's higher the earlier you marry, because you have less information on who this person is going to be as an adult, what kind of person they are and what kind of person they're going to be. And so I just think that we need to call it what it is, which is marriage has always been a way for society to take our worst men and make them some woman's problem. And I mean, like, it is what it is. And so fewer women are willing to do that, and fewer women are willing to take that risk. And I think that if we're going to say, do it for society, well, at least give us the courtesy of admitting what you're doing and admitting what it's going to do to millions of women who roll the dice, and the result is, in many cases, deadly. I mean, the person most likely to murder a woman is her husband.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we also have to look at sort of the secondary economic effects to this, because that's why I don't think these ideas will work. That if we could just marry women younger so they don't go to school and get a job, think of what that affects in terms of the economy. We lose all the benefits that women are going to give to us in terms of, the GDP is going to decline. That means there'll be fewer jobs for the men. You just kind of turn the cycle around that's created so much prosperity in in Western societies. You're going to turn that around and drive it all down. So just from an economic standpoint, I think that that's a bad point of view. The second is I just look at this worldwide. You can go, look in Korea or Europe or places like that, and you're running into the same problems with marriage rates pretty much everywhere. And you're finding that government efforts to change fertility rates and marriage rates don't particularly work. Europe has all sorts of baby bonds and bonuses, and will give you free this, free that if you have kids. Hungary, which is sort of the MAGA favorite these days.
Yeah.
They've tried giving everything they could think of to women: free childcare, all sorts of leave with pay, $5,000 bonus when you have the child, and additional money at each birthday. And marriage rate still went down.
From a
Uh,
policy
and child
perspective,
birth, the number of children born went down. So I think that we are just in a different era. We're not going back to what we've had in the past, and we should be aware that that's not going to be very successful as an approach.
this is just something that popped in my head. Why is it that we still do not have mandatory paid parental leave in the United States? I mean, have you ever looked at that as just from a policy perspective and the um I don't know, the economic impact, the
Yeah,
happiness
it's a mixed
index, whatever.
bag. It's a very mixed bag, and I know people have looked at it in both ways. To some extent, it benefits upper middle class women and educated professional women a lot. It doesn't seem to benefit lower income women as well. They tended to, because of the type of jobs they have, or the type, or their ability to take time off, or their willingness to take time off. It doesn't seem to have as much benefit on them economically as it does on higher income women who take a few weeks off and then go back to the job that they had previously. It
Mm.
also tends to make employers less likely to hire women. We've seen that in some of the European countries.
Japan
Uh,
also, right?
yeah,
They know that women are going they're
it's a cost
yeah.
that they figure in, and so to some degrees, it delays promotions, it delays the hiring. I mean, people always talk about the wage gap between men and women, and the thing is, if you actually take out children out of the equation, that wage gap goes away. The problem is that women take time off to take care of the kids and then come back. To the degree that family leave encourages them to do so, they fall further behind. They haven't got that level of, they lose that time of experience. They lose that time of being in the office and things like that. So it can actually leave them worse off. Men tend to not take it when it's offered. Even when it's offered, men don't tend to take as much of it, or take it at all. And again, that's a cultural thing about who's supposed to take care of the kids and male breadwinner, and the stuff we've been talking about. But it does actually, to some degree, leave women at a disadvantage, at least financially.
Mhm.
Well, it's marriage and childbirth that impacts the gender pay gap. So, marriage, even
Yeah,
without children, also decreases women's pay on average. It increases men's pay. So, when a man gets married, on average, he earns more money. When a woman marries, on average, she earns less money. And the primary reason for that is that when a man and a woman marry, 99% of the time, I made that setup. Most of the time, they follow the man's career because of the male breadwinner norm. And this is true even of women who graduated from Harvard Business School.
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
Um, they followed their husbands' careers. And so, yeah, I mean, Mike, what you were saying about the economic costs to marriage, it's true that a woman getting married doesn't prevent her from going to college and having a career, but it harms her career on average because the male breadwinner model and heavily stigmatizes women who don't make whatever career or educational decisions they want to make. Um, Subservient
Not
to their husbands' careers.
Well, not only that, I think there is still so I've been in the workforce, a long time, and there is still the feeling that you give men more money because they're the primary
Right,
breadwinner, and now they have a spouse and they have
right.
children, so they earn that. And that a woman who's married and has children, theirs is a second income, and there is, whether it's a uh conscious bias or a subconscious bias, it is still happening. Um
Absolutely.
and even for women who stay in the workforce and although I've had fits and starts, and in my first marriage, we moved for his career always, and I was always starting over. And in my second marriage, we've moved more of the time for my career. And that has made a difference, right? There's upward mobility, and I tell young people this all the time. If you really want to get a bump in your salary, m change jobs, because staying in the same job, they're gonna give you these incremental raises, and they're gonna think, "Oh, we gave you, 5%, 10%, whatever." Um, yeah, so but there is definitely that bias in pay.
Yeah, and I don't want to sound overly negative on marriage here. I think marriage is generally a good thing. I certainly am much better off because I got married. I certainly got lucky, but I think it's a wonderful thing, and I do encourage people if they get to marry. But that said, I think we also have to recognize that the power it has to lift people out of poverty, while real, is going to be limited, and we should be a little bit careful about putting too many eggs in a basket of government programs. And we can go back, George W. Bush, who was going to put up billboards around the country saying marriage is good. Now we have Sean Duffy, the Secretary of Transportation, suggesting that he's going to give more highway funds to communities that have higher marriage rates. And I think we need to be a little bit careful about what government can and should do in all of this. And at the same time, acknowledging the fact that marriage is generally uh, a positive thing if you're going to have kids, particularly.
I could talk for hours. It's that's
Yeah,
so
does anybody have any
interesting.
questions?
Yeah.
Like, I wanna definitely we only have a few minutes unless you guys can stay longer, um, but, wanna invite people to ask questions in the few minutes we have left, and yeah, I know, I mean, I am not against marriage by any stretch of the imagination. I've done it once, I'll probably do it again, but, I am very against misogyny, and I think a lot shocking, breaking, more 11, uh, a lot of the messaging and rhetoric is around marriage, especially on the right, is very victim blamey. Women are in poverty because they refuse to get married. It's like blaming, sex positive feminism for declining marriage rates when that's completely insane. It's making promises about what marriage is gonna do for people that aren't accurate. It's, ignoring the real costs and risks to women when they enter into marriage, ignoring the fact that when women are not getting married, they are making a considered, evidence-based, rational decision, and so shaming them about that choice rather than, like, looking at why they've made that choice and maybe changing some of the incentives around that choice is probably a better path forward.
Yeah, I think we could take this with the whole success sequence idea. The question is, why do people not follow the success sequence if
Right.
it works?
Yeah.
And I think one side of this debate sort of says it's a moral failing. They just make bad decisions. They're just bad people. They choose not to get a job or to get educated or to get married. I prefer to look at it as what are the barriers to their getting that job, getting that education, getting married. I think if we can remove those barriers that are there, then I think we can do it. The people will naturally do this. I think there's nothing to suggest to me that poor people are particularly stupid. I think if people can do things that'll advance themselves, they will do so. They're not lazy. They're not stupid. What they are is blocked, and we need to remove those blocks if we
Mhm.
want to get people to get ahead.
Right, like, okay, we could spend money on billboards that say get married, or we could maybe look at the impact of just-in-time scheduling on how easy it is for people to secure childcare, and how that impacts birth rates. Like, this idea that, this is like a cultural or spiritual problem and not just a, "I don't know who the fuck is gonna take care of my kids during my shift" problem.
I can't even imagine what that would have been like. I definitely, if the only kind of job I could have gotten was that kind of job where on Friday they tell you what your schedule's gonna be on Monday, I would never have been able to have a job, let alone a career, And I just I don't know how people do that. It and if it becomes too hard, it's a barrier, right? To
Sure. And it's on the left as well. You could look at the left blocking flex time, for example, which they would enable people to schedule around when they have to drop their children off at childcare and things of that nature. Or restrictions on housing, zoning, one of Kathy's favorite subjects,
Oh, yeah.
I know. But the fact is, if you can't find an affordable apartment with enough bedrooms, you can't have you get married and have kids, and that's those sorts of things play in it. There's actually some good studies out there that show that as rental costs go up, marriage rates go down. So we should look at both the left and right and ask, what are you actually doing in terms of removing those barriers to enable people to get married who want to get married.
And certainly we don't want it to be an economic trap, right? Where the only way you can you stay in a bad marriage because you can't afford to go live in a different place, or all of those kinds of things. So there, I'm
Yeah,
gonna
in
try
fact, the harder
not
you
to
make it to
think it's so.
divorce, the less likely the fewer marriages you get. It actually, again, it goes back to this thing that if you really put a stigma on divorce, make it so divorce is a terrible thing, people are going to be very, very careful about who they marry because they're not going to allow themselves to get in that circumstance. That means they're going to delay it. They're going to take it longer to get married, and that creates its own problems later on.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, the later you marry, fertility, you get whatever the reason, but I guess it seems clear anecdotally, you two are the people who do research and comment on this stuff, but anecdotally, it seems clear that the later up to a certain point, right? You don't want children to get married at 18, because I'm here to say that was a dumb idea. But 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 also you get to a certain age and the likelihood of marriage gets lower. I'm thinking that is statistically, like, if you get to a certain age without marrying, is it unlikely that you will ever marry?
Boy, I can't
That
tell
was
you that off the top of my head.
Oh,
that was like a there was a stat it was like in the 80s where we were having a big moral panic around women being in the labor force. There was a big moral panic around childcare, daycare centers, and there was this stat that a woman is like more likely to be murdered than get married after 30. It
oh, I
was
remember that.
yeah, yeah. And I don't yeah, that's debunked.
But of course, a
That's
lot of that
inaccurate.
80s stuff you just mentioned was completely debunked, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
as I say, I do say that almost everybody gets married who wants to get married. It, the fact is that it's in the 90% range of
Mm,
people who get married eventually. When we look at marriage rates, we're often looking at, are they married today? And it
Mhm.
doesn't say anything about whether they were or they will.
huh.
I do think that one thing that is interesting about marriage is and relationships is that while I do not support encouraging early marriage, I mean, as we said, it's much riskier um, in terms of, getting somebody who's worthless or violent or dangerous. In addition, marriages that are younger are more likely to end in divorce, all else equal. So there's lots of reasons to not want that. However, It's also true that after a certain point, every year you delay marriage, the pool gets shittier because people who are good at being in relationships, when they get into a relationship, tend to stay in that relationship. And so what you have are people who are either bad at increasingly over time, what you have are people who are either bad at getting into relationships or bad at staying in them.
I
Um,
suspect it's some sort of bell curve, essentially, where at one tail, you have people who rushed into marriage right away. That's not necessarily the best pool. Then you have real marriageable people, and then you sort of have the leftovers at the other end of it. So
But I guess like most things, knowing that it will lay out in a normal distribution is sort of comforting, right? So there are gonna be exceptions. Um, and congratulations, Meg. She got married at 19 and she's been married 17 years, but she wouldn't recommend it to people because it's hard. It is hard. And then Rob asks, a lot of people want a lot of people, more so on the right, want policy that allows corporations to be hyper profitable and more exploitative, but also want high marriage rates and are unwilling to acknowledge that, at least on many fronts, you can't have both.
I'm not accusing anyone of anything, but I'm just saying if I were a corporation who profited from exploiting my workers um, in ways that made it difficult for them to get married and have children, for example, on the top half by requiring those workers to work very, or if not requiring, strongly pressuring those workers to work very long hours in ways that are not very compatible with being an involved and active parent, because the higher the skill of the worker, the higher the ROI on squeezing more hours out of them while you have them, especially in an environment where highly skilled workers hop jobs pretty frequently in order to maximize their income. And then on the low end, by doing things like just-in-time scheduling. It might behoove me to pay think tanks to blame things like feminism and Hollywood and liberal values and luxury beliefs on declines in marriage and child rearing, as opposed to my practices as an employer.
as a person here who will defend the market economies here, I would suggest that to the degree that we can create more alternatives in employment to eliminate the friction in moving jobs, you can lower the exploitive power of employers out there. So I think growing economy is often the best solution to all problems in the end.
Well, yeah, high labor demand relative to supply fixes a lot of problems. So just like you disempower landlords by having a lot of units on the market
Right.
relative to people who need a place to live, you disempower employers relative to employees by having a lot of jobs and not enough bodies to fill them. And I think this is hard to prove, but I think on the cultural side, the unsung villain is the male breadwinner model. On the economic side, I suspect the unsung villain is market concentration. I think there are fewer firms than there should be, and that those firms aren't competing with each other to the extent they should be uh, for employees.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do suspect we don't have enough competition that's out there. We've had a lot of regulatory capture, and that has led to a lot of more market concentration. People sort of assume we live in a market-based free market system, and we do not. And as a believer in free markets, I have to say that we could use more of them, and that would go long way towards dealing with some of these issues.
Yeah, and it's hard because it's so complicated and so diffuse, all of the examples of corporatism. So it's hard to know, what does the regulation on the size of the pasteurization machine required to bring your milk to market have on the employment trends in the, dairy industry. There's the complexity of the tax code, which makes tax avoidance easier, especially for firms that have the most resources to throw at lawyers and tax professionals. Um, Hard to calculate, hard to prove
Yeah.
the exact impacts of these kinds of things, but from a just common sense perspective standpoint, you can say, well, this is probably contributing to market concentration, which seems to be contributing to shittier experiences for workers.
Yeah.
I've definitely seen that in the federal contract industry. I mean,
Hmm.
it's kind of socialized, but there's been venture capitalist companies buying up and conglomerating some of the largest federal contractors, and now companies that I work for that used to be primary competition and billions of dollar companies are now under one umbrella, and it's shocking that I mean I don't follow regulation and all that, but it I would think that the concentration in those markets would eliminate competition to the point where the federal government would, in terms of making sure that our industrial complex, if they're and the national security position of the country is more is not as diffused as it used to be. It's way more concentrated than it used to be. And you would think that that would be a national security risk.
And it's frustrating too because it's like the the conversation about marriage and fertility rarely goes into corporatism, corporate, private equity roll-ups, labor practices necessarily. It's very much about like, okay, what can government do? Like mandating maternity, parental leave, offering free childcare, giving baby bonuses, um, erecting billboards that say "Get married." Then there's the cultural arguments, like all of these things that we talk about. Part of the reason we talk about them is because they're very simple. They're easy to understand. Everybody understands what childcare is, and everybody understands the concept of like government providing childcare. A baby bonus is it can be complicated in the execution, but the concept is simple to understand.
Yeah, a check arriving in your mailbox from the U.S. Treasury Department is simple to understand.
Right.
Well, and
Private
that's
equity
why
is hard.
we get these things from both left and right. What you've got is,
Yeah.
Donald Trump wanting $5,000 baby bonds, Trump bonds, with for birth,
Mhm.
and you've got the new Democratic candidate in New York promising free childcare for everybody. So it's the idea of giving people free stuff is easy for people to understand, particularly the people who think they're going to get free stuff. So
And it's easy to code left or right, right? Like free childcare is very obviously left coded. It's a new entitlement, which ironically the working class does not tend to prefer new entitlement programs, new assistance programs, but it's and it is in the popular imagination, it's seen as something to help women. Like nobody would imagine that childcare would keep a man out of the labor force, even though it could. Why
Mhm.
not? But that's not how it's coded. It's coded as a way to get women into the labor force, which is left coded because the idea of the stay-at-home mom is right coded. And so these ideas are if an idea is easily left or right coded, uh, um, a baby bonus is more right coded, free childcare is more left coded, then people like to talk about those things because they love to signal which team they're on. Um, but something like corporatism is not left or right coded particularly. And so it doesn't have that advantage of signaling left or right status, and tribal loyalty. And then there's the issue of, again, profitable, large, incumbent corporations have a strong incentive to get us to fight about baby bonuses and childcare and never talk about corporatism or mergers or market concentration or the complexity of the tax code or any of these other things, their labor practices. Like, they don't have any incentive to pay experts and influencers and to fund candidates who are going to make that a central part of their campaign.
Yeah.
I think you're right, and of course, they often benefit from these things. This childcare that we're mentioning, there's essentially four big providers of childcare in the country. Talk about market concentration that qualify for all these subsidies when we subsidize childcare. The little mom and pop spot down the street, or the one in the church basement, which is what most low income families prefer, they don't qualify for most of these subsidies. They can't meet the paperwork requirements and the education requirements for the instructors and the pay requirements and those sorts of things. They get sort of shoved to the side, and the big daycare providers sort of went out on the other things there.
I
So,
never even like 4? That's like, oh my gosh.
I'm going to become the Joker. I'm going to have an aneurysm. Like, it's so, like, once you said it, I'm like, of course
Yeah.
that's the reality, but it never
Yeah.
occurred to me.
I think I'm afraid I hate to tell you this, but I do have to run.
Oh, it was
Thank
lovely
you
to
so
meet you,
much.
and thank you so much.
It was wonderful.
It's a pleasure meeting you, Cathy. It's always a pleasure. Keep writing. For anyone out there who's listening who doesn't sign up for our newsletter, you're crazy. It's one of the best that's out there.
Yeah.
Not always
Thank
suitable
you.
for work, but it's definitely worth reading. There's more intellectual
It's
heft in it
thought
than you
thoughtful,
know.
well written. It's
Thank you.
wonderful. Yeah,
Thanks, guys.
wonderful.
I appreciate
Sign up.
it. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you,
Thank
Michael.
you.
Thank you guys for coming. Appreciate you asking questions, giving us your comments, and yeah, we'll see you guys soon. Good night.
Night.
Night.